What's up, Cosmetic family?
Thank you for joining us on the Cosmetic Podcast.
Cosmetic means being a person or thing that gives rise to a phenomenon that is dynamic or energizing.
We're tackling topics and telling the truth.
I'm Keith Benson.
And I'm Rodrigo Ross.
And so today we're talking about the power of the pen. We're here with author Ar'Sheill Monsanto. She's worked in advocacy work, does some public policy, community organizing for over 15 years. I mean, this lady is all over the place doing some remarkable things. And her book is all about this whole space of policies in schools. And as we look at our kids of color and how that discipline is happening, tell us a little bit about some of the research that you've done to be able to see what these gaps are with our young people.
Sure, and thank you for having me on the show today. Really happy to be here. I feel like I'm back home, and I say that because, I spent 6.5 years of my career at the YMCA. So this feels really great to be here.
Good. This is so exciting.
Yeah.
So you mentioned some of the research in the book.
Yeah.
Where would you like me to start?
Yep. Talk to us about some of the research. Because there's some deep stuff that you have in your book, just reading over some of your notes and how you got to this point, really excited about it. And we'll talk a little bit more about it as we go throughout the program with when it's going to come out and all that. But I want to just go ahead and take a deep dive into the research right there. What was some of the key things that you found, about, school-based programming and disciplinary actions, in particular to our kids of color?
Yeah, so the title of the book is called Kids in Cuffs, Striving for Equity and Empathy in Education. And I got the title because of everything you just named, looking at how schools highly discipline Black and brown students of color, students in special education, students with disability. And the book is written in 3 parts. So the first third of the book, I focus on some of the stories that I've seen, things that we may have seen on the news about 6-year-olds maybe getting handcuffed in schools for having a temper tantrum. Things like that, along with some research. And then the second piece of the book focuses on just reimagining what schools could look like. Do we need metal detectors? Do we need police in schools? Should we have more counselors? And then that third piece is sort of where my expertise comes in from that policy perspective. It looks at a framework where we look at policy systems and environmental changes and figure out how do we use this framework that's been used in public health to change behaviors? How do we do that in an education setting?
I love that whole reimagining space, right? So many times when you read a book, you get all the pertinent research and you get all this information about why this book is important, and then it goes straight to the framework. But the fact that you spent time said, let's just spend a little bit of time imagining, right? Reimagining what this space could look like. I love that. That's excellent. And so what are some of the reimagined things that came up in section 2 of the book?
Well, section 2 was actually my favorite. So the first interview I did was with a woman that I call her the guru of restorative justice. She doesn't like that title, but she is all things restorative justice. And in that interview, when she and I were talking, when I thought about restorative justice as just a parent, and keep in mind, I've never taught in anyone's classroom. My frame of reference for schools has been when I was a student, or now that my son, he's 5, he's in school now, when he was a student. So I don't have the ins and outs of it. So as I'm learning about restorative justice, I looked at it as this thing that was juxtaposed against punitive discipline, right? So you either have the warm and fuzzy, let's talk about it, or you have, the smackdown in terms of discipline. And that's not what it is. The way she explains it, it is this full circle moment where love is infused, right? We see kids, we see them as humans, and that's where the empathy piece comes from in the book. We really want to be empathetic to situations because we don't know what happens outside of the classroom, right? It could be a myriad of things. A child may come in with a headache and wants to put his or her head down, and they could be punished for that. So we look at students as, we look at the whole child, kind of like how you guys do at the Y. Like, it's not just like this one component. We don't just want the student's brain, like we want all of them. And it has to be infused into the entire environment of the school. And I don't know if you guys remember, like, being in school, you just had like this favorite teacher that you can always just like talk to about things. We want that to happen at all levels. Like, it has to be like deeply ingrained in the culture. So that was one of the pieces that was probably like my favorite part to write and research, just learning more about restorative justice.
Nice. I love that. I do remember my favorite teacher. It was in the 3rd grade. Her name was Miss Catanzaro. I remember that.
You still remember, yeah.
I still remember that.
Well, my favorite was Miss White, my 1st grade teacher, and I think that was my first crush also.
You remember way back then? All the way back to first?
Watch out now. Watch
It
out.
was his first crush.
It was that's what it was, right? You heard that part, huh?
So, according to Howard Zer, he's recognized in that as I did some research on this and looking at restorative justice, so he's one of the founding fathers of restorative justice. And he has this concept of 3 pillars. So number one was harms and needs, which is about that empathy for all and by all. And then obligation, which was, it's that obligation to put right in place. And so a sorry is just a mumbling sorry, like I'm sorry. That's not enough. We need a little bit more to the process that. And then the third thing was around engagement. So engagement of all the stakeholders so that everyone is involved in this healing process. As you took a look at restorative justice, what were some of the programs or best practices that you see in some of the research that you did when you were writing your book?
Yeah, and Howard Zer, he is considered the founder of restorative justice. And I would point to a lot of schools are doing it well. If I had to have one district that stands out, I would say the Oakland Unified School District. And that's because they've been doing it for quite a while. So it's taken them a couple decades to get things kind of where they are now. And in that, I would say in Houston, where I live, there are specific school districts that have really incorporated that framework. So they have student court. So instead of, when we were in school, you did something, you got in trouble, you got suspended, you went to the principal's office, and that was the end of that. Some of these school districts now, they're starting to incorporate the peers into the process. And it's also more reflective. So let's say you had a bad day, you're a student and you lashed out at your best friend, like a person you love and care about, but you weren't the one like in that moment, and you just lose it, right? And you have a fight, you get into trouble. After it's over, you have a moment to reflect on it. Like, I just got a C in this class. I've been thinking about this. I have to work after school. I just took it all out on you. And with the restorative justice framework, like, it gives that ownership. Like, you get to be part of that process, and you don't just mumble like I'm sorry to say it, just to say it. Like, you really get to be reflective of like what role you played into it and how you would correct that moving forward, and how like what tools do you need to not do that again? Like, when you're starting to be triggered, like, what do you need to do? And there's just this big community around it, and that's what makes it work.
Right as you said that, I thought about adults who struggle, right? Like, they'll have these moments, whether it's in the workplace or even at home in their personal lives, where just all of the woes of the day just are on you, and you just lash out, and then you have that moment afterwards like, oh, that wasn't the best decision. But so many folks, that's where they get hung up. They don't know what the next step should be. They don't know how to fix it. They don't know how to kind of go back and recreate an environment. And that's because, as you're saying it now, we don't teach children that. Like, the tools that kids need as adults, they learn it as children. And I'm just thinking, how much more innovative would people be if they know that, I could mess up, I could have a bad day, I could say sorry, we can restore it. Like, what, that just hit me, how profound that is, that when you help kids build that skill, you absolutely create better adults. Man.
Yeah. And even like what you're saying, like how are we holding children and they're kids, I don't care if they're 17, like they're still babies. Like how are we holding them to this standard that a lot of us as adults can't even hit?
We can't, right? We can't even, and people figure out ways to justify it and all of that as an adult. But you're absolutely right. When a kid does it, it's just a whole, wow, that is so deep.
Well, what was some of the deep data that you found? I mean, some data that was just like outright disturbing to you.
Oh, that's a good question. I think my initial reaction, data that was just like, you got to be kidding me, was that suspensions start as early as preschool.
I believe it. Yep.
So you think about a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old getting suspended for behavior that at the end of the day is probably appropriate for their age. Like it's not appropriate behavior, but it's within that like development. So it starts as early as preschool. And oftentimes it's not necessarily just, I wrote this suspension out, your kid can't come back here. Sometimes it's inadvertent, right? So it's like, hey, your kid can't come here for 3 days. Your kid bit a student. So it's technically a suspension, but there is no paper trail associated with it. And then another piece of data that stood out, and I believe this was national, whereas you see that Black boys followed by Hispanic boys, then Black girls are more likely to get suspended. It looks like these kids are bad, right? Like you have this bunch of kids, the data saying that they're X times more likely to be suspended. They must be bad kids. But research states that they're not either bad or worse than like any of their counterparts.
Wow. It's just how we're doling out the punishment. You know, I believe that. And thinking back, you know, as a kid, there were definitely some of those kids and growing up in Brooklyn and going to school that more times than not, they were suspended. But when you talk to them, when they come back to school and you find out what they were suspended for, sometimes you're like, well, I saw XYZ do that and they didn't get suspended. But as soon as that kid, once you get like on that trajectory, and that it creates this flywheel, and that's the only way, unfortunately, that folks wanted to deal with them, is like before they had a conversation, before they tried to figure out what really happened, the first thing was, oh, they're always in trouble. They always get suspended. They never say anything about it. The parents may not advocate, you know, no one is coming up to the school to really hold someone accountable about why you taking my child out of this learning environment, that they just suspend them.
And then sometimes that leads to that being a part of that student's brand. So let's say you were constantly getting into trouble in 3rd grade, teachers talk. Once you go 4th, 5th, and 6th, you're labeled like that bad kid. And the kid may be like, well, I am the bad kid, so I'm doing what it is I'm expected to do.
You know, we're talking with Ar'Sheill Monsanto, and just wrote an incredible book, Kids in Cuff, Striving for Equity and Empathy in Education. What's your big hope that people get out of your book?
My biggest hope, I want this to be a tool. And I was talking to some women earlier today, and you know, the last part is this framework for change. So you're looking at policy, systems, and environmental change. And I think if you don't have that policy background, you're just like, what? Like, what is this? It's too big for me. And sometimes when we think about policy, we think about the president of the United States, or we think about the governor, but we don't think about where the power is in our communities. So school board, like you could run for a school board seat if you wanted to. You can get on your kid's PTA. You can join the PTA. You could have a conversation with your school principal about policies at the school, or asking questions. What type of diversity and inclusion training are the teachers receiving? Because a lot of times, like teachers, they're trained in their subject. So you may know math, you may know science, and you may be phenomenal at that, but you may not know about childhood development. You may not know about that. You may not know how to deal with restorative justice. And some of the teachers that I've talked to in the past, a lot of their like teaching style is based off what they received growing up. So if you had a strict teacher and that's how the classroom was kept quiet, that became your style. Like you pattern your teaching after that, and you oftentimes just don't have the skills. And when you think about teachers, they're teaching, they're the social worker, they're the second mom. Sometimes they have to bring food to the kids, so they're like they have so many roles, and we want to make sure that they're empowered. So my hope for the book is that, you know, we as regular people, we as parents, we as caregivers, that we have a tool to learn how to like navigate these conversations and advocate for change on behalf of our kids.
Yeah. So, you know, we at the branch that I was at formerly, we had an early childhood learning program, and what we learned quickly was that many parents saw where their children were, after they left our program, or if they had older siblings, they saw where their children were consistently not being treated fairly, and they definitely had some opinions about it and they wanted something done, but they didn't quite have the skill set to go in there and be an effective communicator and to advocate for their child. And in some instances, you know, there is this balance that has to happen about what are some of the things that parents need to do, environments they need to help create so their children could be successful, and how do they hold a school accountable. In your research, did you find, or did you see where, if that balance is right, like if we teach parents how to advocate, but also talk to them about the importance of what is your part in creating an environment so your child can be successful, like how does that weigh into the restorative justice framework?
Yeah, so toward the end, when I look at that framework, I do break it down by those three components: the policy, systems, and environmental change. And I think the parent's role is sort of like in the environment, right? So you want to feel like you can talk to your school's principal. And you also, when I think about like the physical environment, if you are walking your kid into a school that has metal detectors, where there's a presence of police, you need to have a conversation around like what's happening. Like, okay, I see an officer here. How many social workers are on campus? How many counselors are on campus? Because what happens if we're not having these conversations and we're not making it known, we're not putting like school leaders on notice, like you need to have some more counselors here. Because if there is no counselor and there is a police and your kid does something and the teacher may not know how to manage a classroom, who are they going to call? They're going to call the police in. And oftentimes, like you may get an officer that's actually nice or may not want to be part of the discipline, but once they're called in, they have to follow through. And if that means arresting a 6-year-old, which is what we've seen in the media before, then that's what it means.
Wow.
So as you were writing this, what did you find out with that history of the police in schools? Like, how did that even become a thing? Because I'm amazed. I went to jail one time to visit someone, and the process of going to visit that individual was that you had to go through metal detectors. And then I go into schools now and I go through a metal detector, and something to me that just doesn't feel right. That you got police in schools, you have metal detectors in schools. So how did the police become that heavily involved in that? That's, you know, now school systems even have their own police systems now.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I feel like a lot of people believe that police started in schools in the 90s. If you remember the 90s, there was this stance where like people were just like tough on crime, and there was this zero tolerance policies. And at the national level, there was funding for metal detectors and for more police in schools. And oftentimes, like there were gangs in the community. So police were put into those urban districts where the gangs were. So a lot of people believe that it started in the 90s. But in the book, after doing research, I found out that it started much, much earlier than that. So think about like the 40s or the 50s, and police at that time, they were there to protect, to uphold segregation.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Wow. And then they just transitioned into, Wow, that is so interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So do you feel, especially after having done the research and reimagining and outlining a framework, do you really feel that overall that the education system there can be a shift, like this can happen, this absolutely can better serve our kids?
I do. And I say that not just as an idealist, but I say that as a person who owns an iPhone. Right? When you think about it, like before the iPhone came out, we had the types of phones that we had and we were completely fine with it. It took one person to reimagine what this could be. And I also use like the iPhone analogy because some school districts, the district that I live in specifically, maybe like 2 years ago, there was a student who had an earring in his ear, and he had the earring because his older brother had it. And the parent was like, they told the parent like he can't come here with the earring, like he has to put the bandage on his ear. Boys cannot have earrings, and it was a big back and forth. Like it made the media, and the school district released a statement saying, we will look into our policy. It's been our policy since 2007, but we'll look into it. And I'm like, 2007 is the year that the first iPhone came out. Are you still using the same iPhone from 2007? No, you are not. Like you're innovating. You want new features. And I think that we can do that in schools. I absolutely do.
Nice. That's a great analogy.
Yeah, it is. I like it there. I mean, so what's the system? What would you see as a system or one or two systems that school systems should really consider changing these things? I mean, there's been, different things, and you gave the earring incident, right? And then we got, the hair, with the young man that's on the wrestling team, and like, how to even make it to that level without cutting his hair before. So like, why is it an issue right now? Like, what other systems that you see or policies that you may have experienced that like, man, these things, we need to be moving on this because it's impacting our kids of color mainly.
Yeah. I would definitely say school dress codes along with like codes of conduct, because the hair thing, the kids you're talking about, I believe that issue was from 2017. And just 2 years ago, there was a similar case here in Houston where, a kid had dreadlocks and he put his hair in a ponytail. And once it was out of the ponytail, he was considered in violation. So much so that he was pretty much being harassed. Like he and his cousin, like school administrators would come seek them out to make sure they were compliant. And the minute his hair was like touching his shoulders, a suspension. When kids are suspended, they're taken out of the classroom and they're not learning.
Right.
When they're not learning, we see it in these test scores. We see it in graduation rates. And some kids, if they keep being like flagged, then they eventually drop out or they're pushed out. So I would say that is like one quick way that we could reimagine some things, just, getting up to date on dress codes, codes of conduct. The world has changed. Yeah. And then the second aspect I would say is definitely providing like the right training for educators, or not just educators, like people that work with children in general. Like if you are on a campus, I think there should be some type of training around diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, cultural competency is real. And really understanding what's important, what's not important, what things have cultural relevance to young people, understanding the history behind dreadlocks. I mean, and there are some folks, right, in the dreadlocks example, some of them just wear them because they're on trend right now, but there is absolutely a history behind why that hairstyle is important, particularly to kids of color. I love it.
So what would you see the YMCA's role in some of this? Like, we have after schools, of course, all across the country, one of the largest childcare providers in the country, and in probably most local areas where Ys are. How does the Y and its programming need to think about, education policies as it relates to our programs?
That's a good question. I've always seen the Y as an ally. So because you're licensed differently than with schools, you know, they have their own set of standards, and at the Y it's different. And I feel like you have more flexibility to really implement the changes that you want to see. So we mentioned earlier about suspension starting as early as preschool. Like, what are you doing in your preschools, in your early learning programs to make sure they're culturally relevant, to make sure that parents feel empowered to start having these conversations with you all, so that by the time the kid is in kindergarten, like they do this, like they know how to navigate these tough conversations. And then I think what you all are doing with some of your programs, like Black Achievers, I feel like you give kids that empowerment that they may not get in schools. So pretty much keep doing what you're doing is what I'm saying.
Thank you.
Don't take that to the bank. This has been amazing. Thank you, Ar'Sheill. And look, you guys, y'all heard it. Kids in Cuffs, striving for equity and empathy and education. Go out, pre-order your book. You will not be disappointed. This is everyone's business, right? This is everyone's responsibility. Super excited for you. I know you are going to do amazing things.
Well, let me ask one more question before we drop out. Hey, Can you share with the listeners? We got people not just within our DFW area, but all across the country that I think would take a great interest in your book. Can you share with people how they can maybe get in contact with you, as well as get a copy of your book?
Yes, so to get in contact with me, just search my name, Ar'Sheill Monsanto. I'm on Instagram, I'm on LinkedIn at gmail.com. That's my email address. To get a copy of the book, right now I'm taking pre-orders. So there's a campaign to fund the project. And you can find that link on my LinkedIn or my Instagram. And the books you can pre-order, and they will be in your mailbox by December.
Oh, nice. Good Christmas present. Yeah. All right.
Good holiday gift giving presents.
Perfect stocking stuffer.
Perfect timing. Well, thank you so much, Ar'Sheill. This has been amazing. And thank you all for listening to Cosmetic,
where we're tackling topics and telling the truth.
Subscribe and listen to us weekly.
And don't be shy. Give us a 5-star review.
And as always,
be dynamic.
Be phenomenal.
Be Cosmetic.